Memorial Museum and Library, I extend a very warm welcome to all those who are present this afternoon for this public lecture on I Split in the Family, the Asaf Alis in the Indian National Movement 1928 to 1947. We have the great privilege of having with us today a renowned diplomat as well as historian, Dr. TCA Raghavan, who is former Indian High Commissioner to Singapore and Pakistan. Recently, he retired as Director General of Indian Council of World Affairs. Also, he has written a number of important books on the history of modern India. So I extend a very, very warm welcome to you, sir. It's indeed a pleasure. And as you know, I have been talking to you for a long time about the possible lecture here. So it gives all of us immense pleasure that today finally this lecture is happening. And of course, we hope to have more such lectures, but at least today we are having this lecture. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And I extend a very warm welcome to all our members of the audience, those who are there online and those who are with us in the seminar hall. Uh, the topic of Dr. Raghavan's lecture, of course, as you can see, the Asaf Alis in the Indian National Movement, 1928 to 1947. It is, as he himself describes it, more biographical than historical. Of course, biography is not totally separate from history or historiography, but there are certain things which I believe he is going to focus on in this lecture. Some of the personal things which are not so well known, how these two people who were so different in so many ways, of course, they came from different religions and they got married in the late 1920s, which was a very, very unusual thing. An interreligious marriage at that time was very unusual. They were 20 years apart in terms of age. Aruna was 20 years younger than Asaf Ali. And then, of course, there were many other things which were very, very unusual. And I believe Dr. Raghavan has delved deep into the lives of these two important freedom fighters and the leaders who can probably fittingly be described as second rung leaders, about whom not enough is there in the public domain. So the importance of this lecture is also this, that about the first rung leaders, we generally have adequate information, but about people like Aruna and Asaf Ali, we do not have sufficient information, especially about the trajectories of their personal lives as it cut across freedom struggle, other important leaders, their interactions, etc., their belief systems, their contribution to various movements, and so on and so forth. So I believe that in the next 40 minutes, we are going to hear a lot of great information on all this and insights and various other things from Dr. Raghavan. So without any further delay now, I would like to once again welcome Dr. Raghavan and invite him to proceed with his lecture. Please,
Thank you very much, Dr. Mishra. Great privilege to be addressing the audience here today and also online using the platform of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. I'm very privileged to have been invited. I've been its regular user since 1976 or 1977, and although I'm not an academic, I have been coming here since my student days, and this is as good an opportunity as any to thank all your staff for their competence, for their professionalism, and also for the very helpful attitude they have always had and greatly helped me in all my work. As you said, the 75th anniversary of our freedom movement, of our freedom, provides a vantage point to see an interplay of the personal and the public, and the interpersonal and the political. That the Indian national movement and with the Indian National Congress at its head was a broad church is of course well known, and that it comprised within it different ideological and intellectual standpoints and encompassed virtually the entire political spectrum of the day, as also a great diversity of social background. All these are well known facts. The broad political trends, the ideological and intellectual controversies, the dynamics of different factions, and the interests which were behind these different factions have been examined by many scholars in the past. Nevertheless, the biographical counterpart of each of these factors remains relatively underexplored. Particularly so if we look below the key leaders or the top level leaders, such as Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Patel, or in an earlier generation, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Gokhale, Subhash Chandra Bose, for instance, we have a number of good biographies. But if we look at the rest of the leadership of the Indian national movement, we actually don't know that much about it. And this really is my interest in today's talk, in the to situate the biographical in the wider context of the historical, because I think that provides an opportunity to take a more animated view of some of the key moments of our freedom of our freedom movement. Perhaps I should declare at the outset that my perspective is from the perspective of a public or even a popular historian rather than an academic history per se. Perhaps this distinction between public history and academic history is becoming less relevant than it was 2 or 3 decades earlier. But I thought I should make this clarification because the Nehru Memorial Library has always had a very enviable reputation of great academic and theoretical rigor. So I do not want to be accused later of being too simplistic or saying things which are well known to all of you. So my apologies in advance. Let me begin by saying that two undercurrents or two broad motives form a recurrent theme in Indian history over the first half of the 20th century. Very broadly, these can be characterized as the constitutional approach versus the agitational, and of course, secondly, the communal divide. Neither of these two broad themes or trends requires much explanation. These are well known. And of course, it is also well known that these are by no means the only trends. There are a number of other forces which are operating as undercurrents or broad themes in the Indian national movement. You have the entire Ambedkarite tradition, the movement of the Dalits. You have a women's movement. You also have very powerful trade union and socialistic tendencies. So there are a number of other trends and themes, but nevertheless, the constitutional approach versus the agitational and the communal divide also stand out as important recurrent themes in the first half of the 20th century. So, for instance, if you look at the 20th century as a whole, when one talks about the constitutional versus the agitational, you have the Congress split between the moderates and the extremists in 1916. It is not so much about substance as it is about tactics. And that debate repeats itself in the 1920s between the Swarajists and the others in the Congress, in the 1930s between those who want to contest elections and those who want to continue civil disobedience, and finally in the 1940s, right up to the cabinet mission plan and perhaps beyond. Similarly, the second theme, which is of the communal divide, also needs no great explanation. The Hindu-Muslim polarity underwrites key milestones of modern history, such as the 1905 partition of Bengal, the 1916 Lucknow Pact, the Congress League differences from the 1930s onwards, culminating finally in the partition of 1947. My talk today, however, focuses on two individuals who, in their personal life stories, were at the intersection of these two broad themes, these two recurrent themes of the national movement. In many ways, the lives and politics of Asaf Ali and Arna Asaf Ali compress the story of modern India with all its political tensions and contradictions. We can also see their common biography as a kind of joint cultural crossover, as they encompassed within their marriage the most sensitive of all social divides, as equally the left right divisions in the national movement. Now, my talk really focuses on the period 1928, which is the year in which they got married up to 1947. But let me just bring the story up to 1948, both for Asaf Ali and for Asaf Ali. Now, Asaf Ali, as is well known, there's a road named after him in Delhi, and everyone knows of the road, even if they may not know about.
There is a road named after Rona Asaf Ali.
After both.
To JNU.
So more people know about the roads than about the people. So there's a road named after him. But he came from a Delhi family and was a Congress leader of some prominence, beginning from the early 1920s onwards. He had studied in St. Stephen's College, thereafter went to England, completed his law at Lincoln's Inn, and when he came back was influenced a great deal by Khilafat. I'm sorry. He was influenced a great deal by Khilafat, by the Khilafat movement, by the Home Rule League, of which he was an active member, and thereafter by the Indian National Congress. He was active in the Rowlatt Satyagraha, thereafter in the non-cooperation movement, went to jail a number of times in the early 1920s, and then as the communal divide grew, particularly after the non-cooperation movement, we find him taking more and more interest in the Swarajists. Now, the bare bones of this biography actually is quite dry and dull. But fortunately, when Asaf Ali was in jail in Ahmednagar in the 1940s, he wrote a long autobiographical account of his early years, and that helps us animate these early years up to 1928, because we find in it descriptions of how he grew up in what was then a political backwater, which Delhi was in the late 1890s. He was born in 1888. The first decade of the 20th century, Delhi was very much of a political backwater. It was really cut off from the principal intellectual trends then in Calcutta, in Bombay, in Madras, and in other urban centers. When he comes back from England as a qualified barrister, he becomes a great friend of very important persons in Delhi at the time, such as Dr. Ansari, Muhammad Ali, the Khilafist leader, Abul Kalam Azad. But while he was in London, he had also forged friendships with Sarojini Naidu and someone called Sayyid Hussain, who's also a prominent figure at that time in the second decade of the 20th century. After returning to Delhi, he has numerous brushes with the local administration, the colonial administration as such. So these accounts really animate that period of his early life before 1928. He contested an election in 1926 as a Swarajist candidate, which was unusual in that he was a Muslim contesting from Delhi, which was a Hindu majority area, and it was a general seat. He's soundly defeated in that election. And that election itself forms a separate story, because that election in 1926 followed a period of intense polarization in Delhi for a number of reasons. One is the communal rioting and the polarization which had taken place in many parts of India, the Mopla rebellions in the south, also the differences which existed within those who at one time were very active in the non-cooperation movement, and in particular Swami Shraddhanand, and Swami Shraddhanand himself was murdered soon after the election. So all these factors, in particular the communal polarization, led to a pretty convincing defeat, which people like Motilal Nehru, the Swarajist leader who had campaigned for Asaf Ali at that time very strongly, saw as a personal defeat. Uh, but in any event, in 1928, we find Asaf Ali at some kinds of a crossroad. And you can possibly, although he doesn't say so himself, but possibly it was a kind of turning point in his life, because should he stay on in the Congress? What is the future of a Muslim in Delhi's politics if voting is going to be on largely on religious lines? I'll return to these points, but Aruna Ganguly, Aruna Asaf Ali was Aruna Ganguly. On the other hand, is about 18 or 19 when she marries Asaf Ali. So it's an unusual marriage, as Dr. Mishra said. The Hindu-Muslim marriage in the 1920s is unusual by any standards. But there's also a 20-year age difference. Asaf Ali then is about 40. She's about 19. She came from a very well-known Brahmo Samaj family. Both from the maternal side and from the paternal side. Her mother was from a family of very distinguished Brahmo musicians and Brahmo leaders. Her father had also been in some ways an unusual figure, because unlike most educated Bengalis of that time, instead of becoming a civil servant or joining the bureaucracy or becoming a lawyer, he decided to go to the United States and learn catering. And he came back and set up a restaurant. He joined a firm of well-known railway caterers at that time, and ended up with a restaurant of his own in Nainital, which was this very anglicized summer capital of the British in the United Provinces. His uncle, his father's brother, was Rabindranath Tagore's son-in-law, which again gives you some sense of the social standing of this particular family. In the year in which the marriage took place, 1928, Nagendranath Ganguly, her uncle, had been nominated as a member of the Royal Commission on Agriculture. So this was a family of some standing, and therefore a Hindu-Muslim marriage, when she is marrying essentially a lawyer involved in public affairs and political affairs, was quite an unusual development. She came from a family background which was highly anglicized, and we have some evidence of that, because she recalled later that she was brought up in a home atmosphere that was anglicized, and she recalled that her mother, quote, felt that unless we spoke and wrote and thought in English, we would not get on in life, unquote. By the latter, quote, I think she meant that we would not get married into families that wanted girls who spoke English fluently and with the correct accent. So clearly she had been brought up in a way to marry someone who was in the bureaucracy or a well-placed lawyer, rather than a cross-religious marriage and marry this relatively unknown lawyer, but someone who's coming up in political life. But clearly there's something in the family which encouraged the daughters, at least, because her brothers, there were 3 brothers, they all had very, very conservative, predictable lives. But the 2 sisters, which is Aruna Asaf Ali, Aruna Ganguly, and her sister Purnima, who became Purnima Banerjee, are very unusual women. Purnima Banerjee was one of the few women members of the Constituent Assembly. She went to jail a number of times. She was active in the Congress and was well known as a radical congresswoman in the 1930s and 1940s. So there is something in this family background which otherwise appears very conservative, middle of the road, but certainly that the women in the family strike out in this unusual way does suggest something different about it. Now, after the marriage takes place, I don't want to go into all the details, but this was not the marriage was by no means by either side. It was not a secretive affair. There was no intent. There was no attempt by either Asaf Ali or by Aruna to have a secret marriage. This is very much of a public declaration that they are getting married. There's an advertisement in the newspapers, and therefore, because of all this publicity, the reactions also are quite adverse. And there is a great deal in terms of adverse reactions, but I'll stick to just two particular quotes. One is from the newspaper Milap, founded by Lala Lajpat Rai, and in its time was known as a very strongly Hindu nationalist newspaper. And this suggested a political motive because it wrote, quote, Mr. Asaf Ali Barrister is a Congressy leader of Delhi. In the last elections, he was unsuccessful and was thereupon taunted by the Muslims that the Hindus whose side he had taken had not even given him their votes. But this did not shake Mr. Asaf Ali's Iman, within brackets faith, and he remained a champion of Hindu-Muslim unity. Now Congressy Hindus are highly pleased that Mr. Asaf Ali is going to marry a Hindu lady, Ms. Ganguly. They believe this novel method of bringing about Hindu-Muslim unity will prove more successful. We, for one, have no faith in this new method, but our narrow-mindedness may not appeal to Congressy Hindus who are now turning very broad-minded. So this is clearly very sarcastic, very critical. Now, similarly, the reactions from the other side, from the Muslim reaction, is equally adverse and equally strong. The Times of India attributed at that time to Maulana Shaukat Ali. Shaukat Ali is Muhammad Ali's brother and a very prominent Khilafist in his own right. The Times of India attributed to Maulana Shaukat Ali an editorial in his journal, in his newspaper Khilafat, which said, quote, the Hindu is a creature that knows how to destroy others when they are sleeping, unquote. It remains unclear whether Shaukat Ali's ire was on account of Asaf's marriage. Asaf Ali and Shaukat Ali incidentally knew each other very well from 1911-1912 onwards. It remains unclear whether this ire was on account of the marriage, but another Khilafist newspaper, Medina, made clear its views about the match with this bit of sarcasm, referring to the fact that Asaf had met Aruna in Allahabad while returning after attending the Muslim League session in Calcutta. I quote, the Calcutta League was very successful, for because of it, one Mussalman found a bride and firm and lasting unity was established between Hindus and Muslims. Shout Hindu-Musliman marriage ki jai, unquote. Now these two quotes give you a sense of the very adverse societal reaction which there would have been to this wedding. There were others who were more supportive, regardless of their own personal views, but people like Dr. Ansari, Sarojini Naidu, and others were more supportive at a personal level. But the other interesting reaction is that of Mahatma Gandhi. Now, Mahatma Gandhi, as you know, viewed Hindu-Muslim marriages somewhat unfavorably. His own son at one stage wanted to marry a Muslim girl, and he made sure that that wedding did not take place. Asaf Ali's friend from London, Syed Hussain, who had come back to India, joined the Bombay Chronicle, and then was asked by Motilal Nehru to set up the Motilal Nehru's newspaper from Allahabad, the Independent, or the leader. So while Syed Hussain was in Allahabad, he was staying with Motilal Nehru, and he secretly married Vijay Lakshmi, the girl, Motilal Nehru's daughter, who was later Vijay Lakshmi Pandit. And Gandhi and Motilal Nehru worked very hard together to make sure that this matter remained secret. Syed Hussain The marriage was, I mean, it was meant to be an informal marriage, but it was virtually erased from memory, although some scandal remained. And Sayyid Hussain was packed off first to England and then to the United States to be the Indian National Congress representative over there. Basically, Mahatma Gandhi was not a great fan of Hindu Muslim marriages. But this wedding he did not disapprove of, which is very interesting. And you wonder why. That why did he not object to Asaf Ali and Aruna Asaf Ali marrying? He did not know Aruna, of course. She was far too young. She had not been in public life. Asaf Ali he knew slightly because of the non-cooperation movement, the Khilafat movement. And every time Mahatma Gandhi used to come to Delhi from 1919 onwards, he was in touch with Asaf Ali. And Asaf Ali would receive him at the station. They wrote letters to each other. He wrote about Asaf Ali's jail period in 1921 and 1922. So he knew Asaf Ali. But the interesting point is that he did not really object to the wedding. And instead, Aruna recollects later, quote, when I began to meet Gandhiji after my marriage, I remember that he spoke of it as a symbol of Hindu-Muslim unity. That is Aruna, I protested that I married Asif not because he was a Muslim, but because of the affinity we felt over shared interest in English literature and the impression he made on me with his knowledge of history and philosophy, his agreeable personality, and refined manners. But Gandhiji insisted that our marriage had symbolic significance, unquote. So Mahatma Gandhi too takes a political view of this marriage, much like Lala Lajpat Rai's newspaper or Shaukat Ali's criticism. Mahatma Gandhi too takes a political view. He sees it as a symbol of Hindu-Muslim unity, and one can wonder as to what explains this position in contrast to his opposition to other Hindu-Muslim marriages. Is it because that these were people not very close to him? They were certainly not in the league of his own son or Motilal Nehru's daughter. Or could it be that the communal polarization of the 1920s had modified his views somewhat, which appears unlikely? But certainly, uh, this is a point of interest. Now, after the marriage, Aruna Asaf Ali comes to Delhi, and obviously she has enormous problems in settling down because Asaf Ali lived in Kucha Chalan. It's a locality in old Delhi, in old Haveli, which was owned by his mother and his mother's family. And in fact, when he had come back from England, he had found it difficult to settle down again in this somewhat, uh, uh, somewhat quote unquote primitive environment. And he was very, very critical about the way the house was, the way he had to live. So Aruna, when she comes here from this very anglicized background and upbringing, obviously has enormous difficulties in settling down. But she's obviously a young woman with a great deal of spirit, because when Asif Ali offers that, look, I can hire a flat or a house in civil lines because you'll find it difficult to live in Kucha Chalan, she does not agree. She says you're your mother's only son and your mother will be heartbroken, and she insists on staying on there. But she remembered later, and I quote, when I first came to live in Delhi after my marriage in September 1928, I belonged to an entirely different hybrid Anglo Indianized background. There I found it difficult to fit into a Muslim Indian way of living, hoary hoary traditions with customary manners, etc. Unquote. She is believed to have said later, perhaps only half seriously, that had she known what life in a typical Muslim home was like, she would not have married Asif Ali. But the fact is that she does adjust, and there's a great deal of evidence from the time that she adjusted very well and became a vital member of that community, in the sense that people got to know her very well. They started depending on her. And she was, as I said, a vital member of the community. So this was part of the adjustment problems we faced, but there were other issues too. She was a girl from a convent background, still very young, and then she was now the wife of someone who was reasonably well established in political life, and a lawyer with at least 15 years of experience in the bar in Delhi. So there are a number of social adjustment issues involved there too, and we get a glimpse of this from an account she left of a dinner party she attended when one of Motilal Nehru's relations, someone called Brijlal Nehru, who was a senior officer in the Indian Audit and Account Service and had a bungalow somewhere in Lutyens, Delhi, invited the Asaf Alis for dinner because Motilal Nehru and Jawaharlal Nehru were going to be in town. And Arna Asaf Ali writes about it, quote, I felt lost in what struck me as a sober gathering of elderly persons talking about the problems of the day of which I was utterly ignorant, unquote. So here's this young 19-year-old girl surrounded by people in their 40s or 50s who are discussing the communal polarization, the Simon Commission, the Nehru Report, and she has absolutely no sense at all of what is happening. She says Jawaharlal Nehru joined late, coming straight from a speaking tour in the Punjab, and he was all covered in dust. Arna says, quote, I was dazzled by the first close look of him, unquote. She also recalled, however, that, quote, he looked me up and down with amused curiosity. I was wearing a silk sari and some jewelry, a dolled up slip of a girl destined to decorate drawing rooms, unquote. So you get a sense uh, of the fact that she was obviously feeling completely out of it, out of it uh, all. But clearly, this 19-year-old girl had a great deal of determination and staying power. As I said, she did not agree to Asaf Ali's suggestion that they move out of Kucha Chalan, and she settled down as best as she could and became part of uh, that community. These were, of course, as I said, stirring times. The Simon Commission uh, being the most significant event of the time. But you get a sense of the influences which are uh, bearing down on Arna Asaf Ali from an incident which is very significant uh, for the 1920s and certainly has had a long impact on our history per se. Asaf Ali, although he had lost the elections for election to the Central Legislative Council, liked to go and hear its debates. And Arna Asaf Ali used to often accompany him, possibly just to get out of Kucha Chalan. And one day in April 1929, when they were both at the Legislative Council, that was the very time when Bhagat Singh and B.K. Dutt threw the bomb into the Legislative Assembly chamber. So they were present over there, and certainly you get a sense that that particular development had an enormous impact on her. Subsequently, Bhagat Singh's father traced out Asaf Ali a couple of days later and asked him to defend both Bhagat Singh and B.K. Dutt. And Asaf Ali started appearing for them in the Delhi courts. It subsequently transpired, because of another investigation, that Bhagat Singh was involved in the shooting down of a British officer in Lahore, and that was another case. Asaf Ali was representing them in the case in Delhi about throwing the bomb into the chambers of the Legislative Assembly. Aruna says she recalled that on hearing that her husband was going to defend Bhagat Singh and B.K. Dutt, she was very excited and insisted on attending the proceedings. The trial was closed to the public, but Asif was able, in his capacity as the defense counsel, to get her into a small courtroom set up within the jail premises. A daily newspaper noted that the only outsiders present were the parents of Bhagat Singh and Arna Asaf Ali. Now, when the prisoners entered, now Arna remembers this. She said, the first time I heard this slogan was when the prisoners were brought in, and when the magistrate came in, Bhagat Singh raised the slogan, Inqilab Zindabad. And she said, this is the first time I heard the slogan and I was electrified. My point is that these developments, just because she was married to someone who was in public life, had an enormous influence on the politicization of this young woman. We have, of course, a number of developments taking place from 1929 onwards. The salt satyagraha begins. Thereafter, followed by the civil disobedience movement. Both Asaf Ali and Arna Asaf Ali are jailed for considerable periods of time during these events. But there's also a debate taking place within the Congress at that time about, is agitation the right approach? And someone who was a mentor of how much time do I have?
5 minutes.
Okay, I'll try to
5, 7.
I'll try to wind it up quickly. Someone who was who was a mentor of Asaf Ali, Dr. Ansari, he disagreed very strongly with Mahatma Gandhi on the launch of a civil disobedience movement. He said that the weaknesses which the Congress had could not be papered over, and because of these weaknesses, it would be unwise to embark upon a nationalist protest with an agitation. The reasons for this was that Muslim support for the Congress had dwindled, and important Muslim leaders such as Jinnah and the Ali brothers had stayed away from the salt satyagraha. Shaukat Ali had described it as establishing a Hindu Raj in India, etc. In Ansari's view, the earlier agitations of 1919 and 1920 had been based on the premise of exemplary Hindu-Muslim unity. In 1930, there was a changed situation, as in the preceding years, there had been a calamitous decline in the communal situation. Now, this was really the debate which I had referred to in the 20s too, about the Swarajes, when Asaf Ali had personally witnessed as to how, following an agitation, there is a decline in the communal situation, and perhaps using other means would be more effective. So you find this debate resurfacing, and we can assume that Asaf Ali would have supported Dr. Ansari in this approach, because clearly the efforts to forge a broad Hindu-Muslim united front were not coming out with the results which were expected. In 1934 and 1935, therefore, Asaf Ali worked very hard with a number of others to convince Gandhi that at least some of us should contest in the elections to the Legislative Council. And Asaf Ali himself was a candidate again in 1936 when he gets elected to the Central Legislative Assembly. This is followed by the 1937 elections to the provincial assemblies under the Government of India Act. But this debate resurfaces again in 1939 with the resignation of the Congress ministries following the entry into the following the declaration by the Viceroy that India is also now party to the war. And this debate between 1939 and 1942 really is at the heart of a great deal of intra-Congress politics at the time. Because see, Rajgopalachari, Maulana Azad, Asaf Ali himself, others like Syed Hussain are, are attempting to take a more moderate view that this is the wrong time to launch agitation against the government. But of course, they are finally overruled. The Quit India movement is launched, and you have the entire Congress leadership locked up and put into jail, which the next 3 years, from August 1942 till about February 1943, Asaf Ali, along with the rest of the Congress Working Committee, is in jail. And it is a riveting period of Indian history, because while the Quit India violence and the agitations are going on outside, you have these 12 individuals in jail in Ahmednagar Fort, and they're totally cut off from the world. So they have really nothing to do except gardening, play badminton, attend to the food they're eating, and fight amongst themselves. A number of them have left graphic accounts of this period in jail. And fortunately, Asaf Ali left a diary, but others such as Pattabhi Sitaramaiah, J.B. Kriplani, Nehru himself have written about this. And this brings out the different views and very strong differences of opinion which there were within the Congress at that time. Aruna Asaf Ali, meanwhile, had taken a different track altogether. When the Congress leadership is arrested immediately after the CWC session, she goes underground and then stays underground for the next 3 years, during which time she is progressively more radicalized. And by the time the war is over, these Congress leaders are released from jail, the marriage really has lost that original quality, because Aruna Asaf Ali by then has become a much more radical public figure than she was in the 1930s. She talks about this quite frankly, and Asaf Ali also accepts, possibly to some extent, although it is a very difficult period for him. Throughout the period of his jail in Ahmednagar, he is in a kind of depression, partly because of the political differences within the Congress, but in larger part because of his worries about Aruna. In any case, after they are released, you find that their paths take divergent paths. And this is exemplified during the naval ratings mutiny. Asaf is by then the deputy leader of the Congress in the central legislature, and really, along with Patel and Nehru, trying to take a very, very sober, mature, and considered position on the naval ratings mutiny, while Aruna is very much out in the barricades and denouncing the Congress for having not acted in the manner that she expected them to, or the expectations which they were from those who were mutinying. I don't want to take too much time, but these were really my 2 points about this divergence between the inability of the Congress to understand the concerns of the nationalist Muslims, such as Asaf Ali, and perhaps he felt it with more acutely than others did because of his own marriage. And the second aspect, of course, is about the divergences within the Congress between the constitutional and the agitational approach to be adopted. The rest of their histories are better known. Asaf Ali was inducted as a member of the interim government, but within a few months he was sent as the first Indian ambassador to the United States. He came back about a year later, was governor of Odisha for some time, and then sent as ambassador to Switzerland, where he died in 1953. Aruna Asaf Ali, of course, moved steadily to the left. She was in the Congress Socialist Party, then broke with that and joined the Communists. But her own story thereafter, and she died only in the 1990s, is really a different story altogether, because she was from the Communists, then she shifted back to support to the Congress, was a great supporter of the emergency, was very close to Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi. But it's a different trajectory altogether. I'll conclude by reading out one particular uh, quotation of hers with regard to her reflecting on her own life. Uh, Arna too had reflected on the different paths they had taken, but saw her position not simply in terms of the political gulf that separated her from her husband, but also in more personal terms and in the context of what other women married to those in public life faced. Reflecting on Kamala Nehru and Kasturba Gandhi, she was to write, quote, I am reminded of the problems of adjustment my husband and I had to face, despite the shared modernity of outlook and fondness for English literature which drew us to each other. Asif, with his interest in philosophy and in Greek, Persian, and Urdu literature, helped to enlarge my mental horizons. But my subsequent radical tendencies, especially after 1942, and my enthusiasm for Marxist socialism derived mainly from my reading of Jawaharlal Nehru and some of Bernard Shaw's works, disconcerted my husband. A liberal and constitutionalist by temperament, he could not countenance revolutionary violence and was deeply distressed by my involvement in the Quit India struggle. I can only conclude that these Pygmalion like individuals wanted to mold their wives exactly in their image. Unquote. Now, one could argue that this is perhaps too harsh a judgment of Aruna Asaf Ali, especially on her husband, who himself tried very hard to forge what he would have thought was a liberal and enlightened position for himself and his wife. That he failed in this was possibly less to do with him, but possibly because of the larger circumstances in which they were situated in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Raghavan. That was really a very comprehensive and insightful account on the lives of these two important leaders of the freedom struggle. We are now open to questions and comments.
I have one comment and one question. My comment is that according to you, what is the historical relevance of individual choices made by individuals? Because I don't think that it had any bearing on the freedom struggle or the Hindu-Muslim problem. But I would like to know your views on this. And then you said that Congress failed to appreciate patriotic Muslims. But I thought that Congress went backwards to accommodate them in every way. So if you could tell me what you meant by saying that Congress failed to appreciate patriotic Muslims. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, clearly individual choices were individual. And the fact that Asaf Ali married a Muslim and both were active in the freedom struggle had really nothing to do with the fact that they were of different religions. But nevertheless, when someone is in public life and when an individual choice of that kind is made, it certainly becomes a public fact. It no longer remains just a matter of individual choice because it is widely commented on. It becomes integral to the way in which they are viewed and their politics is viewed. And it is certainly a factor which they have to encounter, and deal with on a regular basis. So it becomes a little more than just their individual choice. But I agree that in the overall scheme of things, it is not relevant. But to understanding someone's personality, it is certainly something which is very significant because it is an unusual thing to have happened. Your second question about Well, this is really the heart of the debate, which took place between the nationalist Muslims and many of the Congress uh, uh, other Congress leaders. I didn't read the whole quotation, but in the part I read when Dr. Ansari writes to Gandhi disagreeing with his decision to launch the civil disobedience movement, the point he makes is that the most important priority before the Congress is that of ensuring Hindu Muslim unity. And this is something which he maintains. He maintains throughout, and after him, it becomes certainly the position of Maulana Azad, of Asaf Ali, of Sayyid Mahmood, and other nationalist Muslim leaders that the central priority of the Congress has to be Hindu Muslim unity and nothing else. And clearly, many other Congress leaders disagree with this, including Nehru himself. They say we can't, yes, Hindu Muslim unity is important, but there are other things which are also important, because if you give this factor an overriding priority, it allows the Muslim League to blackmail us even more than they actually are. I mean, I'm simplifying it, but basically, this was the point. And there was really no answer to this, because, in a sense, both were right. For the Muslims in the Congress, the central issue was that of Hindu Muslim unity. But clearly, this was not going to be acceptable to others because there were other issues which were important as well. In fact, this point really is at the heart of the discussions about the cabinet mission plan. The reason why many in the Congress are deeply uncomfortable with the recommendations about having this three-part federal structure is because that it keeps the country together. If it works, which it may not, it's very complicated. But even if it works, it keeps the country together, but with a very weak center, which would not be able to undertake the kind of activities which they otherwise had the state.
Yeah, if I may add, actually, this entire idea went to the very grain of the freedom struggle, which wanted to create a strong nation once the British were driven out of the country, and it had a certain transformative agenda also,
yes,
social, economic, political, etc. So certainly the unity of the nation was important, and probably the nationalist Muslims who were a part of the Congress were, from their perspective, right in emphasizing the importance of Hindu-Muslim unity. But the fact is that the purpose of gaining independence, freedom, it entailed some other things also.
absolutely.
That entire social, political, and economic vision, was going to be lost if you keep a very, very, very weak center and you cannot intervene in anything. Then unity is all that we could have achieved. So probably this was the predicament, as you
So
said.
this was a debate which is there from early 1930s up to 1947, and it's a recurrent debate. Uh, but as I said, perhaps both were right. But in the end, uh, the Congress, being a broad church, could not become a single issue party. Yeah.
I have a small query. You said that Gandhi had a negative feeling. I'm like he was not supporting Hindu Muslim marriage at that time. But I would like to know, sir, from you, how he got rescued Indira Gandhi's marriage with Firoz Khandan. Please enlighten me with that.
No, Firoz was not even Muslim.
He was not a Muslim.
Oh, Parsi. Sorry. In that
But
regard.
Gandhi
But
and
he was not like Hindu.
he was not a Muslim.
Yeah.
So in that sense, the analogy doesn't apply. But I'm not sure whether he was entirely in favor of it, but it probably went along in the end.
Yeah. Actually, Gandhi had reservations. He was a very practical man, if I can put it that way. The most idealistic as well as the most practical man in some way.
Yeah.
And now that this question has come up, I can tell you about another incident. There was a guy called Manshankar J. Trivedi. He wanted to marry a girl, Italian girl, Elizabeth. And this girl wanted their prospective children to grow up as Roman Catholics. And Gandhi strongly objected to it. And in fact, he gave an Indian name to this lady Elizabeth, Vimla. He said that Vimla must adjust to Indian culture. In her private faith, she can continue to be Catholic. I have no problem. But she must adopt Indian culture, and the children must grow as Hindus only. If you too want to live happily, these were his words. If you too want to live happily and in peace ever after, you must do this. So very, very sound advice that an elderly person could give to a young couple who were contemplating marriage and who came from totally different cultural backgrounds. And this kind of advice he has given on so many occasions about intercaste marriage, about interreligious marriage, etc. Of course, his position was very, very nuanced. So sometimes it's hard to understand why he differed from one case to another. But he himself has given very elaborate. He himself has given very elaborate reasoning about it. For example, the marriage of his youngest son Devdas to the daughter of C. Rajagopalachari. What did he do? Some people think that it was because their castes were different, that Gandhi was not comfortable with the marriage. In fact, this is one of the opinions. The other opinion is that Gandhi wanted to test whether they are really committed to each other. So what Gandhi and Rajagopalachari decided was, when these young people came up to them for marriage, Rajagopalachari told them, "Look, I cannot decide. Bapu will decide." And what Gandhi told them was that, "Look, so you are in love with each other. You will have to live separately, completely separately from each other for 5 years. And if you still love each other, we will allow you to marry." And they had to live separately for 5 years, by the way. And it's only then that Gandhi allowed them to marry. So whether it was this, doubt that he had in mind about their commitment to each other, or the difference in caste, we cannot be completely sure of what was his real motive. But this is how he did it. So there are recurrent cases of this kind. I think we have.
And he is also not entirely consistent.
No,
He
never claimed.
he never claimed to be consistent, but he's not entirely consistent on this issue.
I think we have a question from there, Dr. Nandini Panda. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. This is a fascinating narrative, actually. Wanted to hear more. I would take this presentation from a different perspective. That is women's attitude, writings, and kind of women's movement during the Congress period. And there are many autobiographies and anecdotes. So, Aruna Asaf Ali's writings and her narratives can be used from that perspective. This is my observation. But I have two questions related. One is why Aruna Asaf Ali, she kind of left. I mean, she chose to have a different path, an independent path from her husband. Is it because she found him kind of chauvinistic? This is one question. And second, I mean, Asaf Ali, I don't know. I mean, this is very interesting. That's why I'm asking that he might want her to follow her ideology, her path, and her vision. This is one question. And second question is, why she became radical? Because she had to live, or she chose to live in a backward, quote unquote, backward Muslim household. And she thought that, oh my God, no, this is not the way. So women have their own autonomous domain. So I should choose my own path. Thank you.
Thank you both. Very difficult questions, but thank you for your comment, Dr. Panda. No, I don't think the differences were because she found Asaf Ali chauvinistic, because there's enough evidence that part of their affinity to each other was also an intellectual affinity. that she was interested in literature, and she found Asaf Ali someone who was also, uh, he prided himself on being a poet. He was deeply interested in English literature, and that is, in fact, how their acquaintance came about, and how they decided to get married. Asaf Ali, on his part, certainly made every effort to see that she's not just locked up in home and has a life of stable domesticity. She used to go out with him. She was within a few months. As I mentioned, she was in the Legislative Assembly chamber when Bhagat Singh threw the bomb. So clearly, uh, she was part of his public life from a very early stage of their marriage. We know that she attended the 1929 Congress session in Lahore and subsequent Congress sessions. So clearly, there was no effort to discourage her. But she did have a personality of her own, much like her sister, Purnima Banerjee, that while the men in the family, all the brothers are very conservative, middle of the road individuals, but the two sisters are quite different. And her personality also matures and changes through the 1930s. She finds two very important, apart from Asaf Ali himself, she has two very important mentors. One is Rajeshwari Nehru, the wife of BL Brijlal Nehru, and the other is, oddly enough, Swami Shraddhanand's granddaughter, Satyavati, Satyavati, and these are really her mentors who guide her into politics. And in her recollections, she learnt a great deal of organizational work from Mrs. Rajeshwari Nehru, but she got her radical streak from Satyavati and her great courage, during the Salt Satyagraha and later. So clearly, she was not simply one who was going to follow the path, a path in public life as envisaged by her husband. Asaf Ali envisaged a life for his wife in public life. He did not want her to have only a domestic existence, but she envisaged a different path for herself in public life. And perhaps it had to do with her own personality. One of the problems in finding out more about, finding out such biographical details is that very few of their papers have survived. Because of their long periods of jail, because of the turmoil their personal lives in, very, very few of their personal papers have survived. And you're quite right, Aruna Asaf Ali's journalistic writings, in fact, do give us some suggestions about why she became so radical. And certainly the fact of Bhagat Singh, his defiance, his courage, had certainly a formative influence on her.
Probably, I'm just trying to hint at it. Probably one of the reasons behind the increasing radicalization of Aruna as compared to Asaf Ali, who was a constitutionalist and liberal, can be explained partly in terms of the generational difference. We see it very clearly that the leaders of the freedom struggle who were born after 1900, meaning they grew up basically during the Second World War and in the 1920s, by which time the Russian Revolution had happened and a certain kind of left radical politics had become a powerful influence. We can see that a very large number of them, for one reason or another, they sort of grew up with those kind of beliefs and became increasingly more and more radical during the late 1920s and 30s. So many of them started as Gandhian leaders, in fact. S.A. Dange, of course, is also a very good example of it, because he's writing a book, Lenin and Gandhi, in 1921-22, and later, of course, he becomes, of course, within the Communist Party, he was still regarded as moderate. That's a different matter. So I was just trying to hint at it that maybe this is what partly explains the age gap between the two.
Yeah, the generational factor is
Yes.
there. In fact, one of the problems in this marriage, which becomes very evident during the Asaf's jail confinement in Ahmednagar Fort, is that uh, when you read what he's writing and the way Aruna is often reacting because he reproduces a part of her letters, you're wondering whether is this a husband-wife relationship or a father-daughter relationship, because the 20-year age difference becomes larger and larger in significance as time progresses.
So on the part of Aruna, it's also an ideological revolt against an earlier sort of, generation which was more liberal and more constitutionalist, etc.
Certainly, the generational factor is
Yes.
very important.
Shukla ji?
Thank you.
जैसा कि बताया भी कि आप पाकिस्तान में भी रहे हैं, तो मैडम के क्वेश्चन से एक सवाल मन में आ रहा है कि जिन लोगों को हम इंडिया में नेशनलिस्ट मुस्लिम कहते हैं और दूसरी धारा ये है जो पाकिस्तान लेकर के गई, जिसे हम यहाँ पर कम्युनल वाली धारा कहते हैं, जो पाकिस्तान अंत में लेकर गई, पाकिस्तान के लिए वो लोग नेशनलिस्ट कहलाते हैं। आप जब पाकिस्तान में थे उस समय जो भारत में रह गए मुस्लिम या भारत के लिए लड़ रहे थे, जो पाकिस्तान नहीं गए या पाकिस्तान के लिए नहीं लड़े, ऐसे लोगों के लिए किस तरह का इमोशंस है? और आप जब वहाँ पॉलिटिकल बिहेवियर में काम कर रहे होते हैं उस इकोसिस्टम में, तो क्या अंसारी या अबुल कलाम आजाद ऐसे लोगों से आपको कुछ मदद मिलती है उस तरह की हिस्टोरिसिटी में जाने पर, या क्या इस तरह, या खिलाफ होता है, उनके मन में खिलाफत है इस तरह की चीज?
तो मैं अंग्रेजी में जवाब देता हूँ. Well, it's difficult to say because there is no one general Pakistani reaction. There are different views, and in Pakistan on this particular issue, there is no consensus view. Many in Pakistan, I mean, I remember once I was in a lecture, attending a lecture. There was a professor from JNU talking about it, and a question from the audience was that, Professor, what do you think about partition? So this professor replied that I feel a great sense of loss. So the person who asked the question from the audience responded that, this is the problem because I feel a great sense of liberation. So there are different views about partition. Many people in Pakistan feel a sense of guilt that they left and have come to a country where their future is secure, but they have left people behind. There's that sense of guilt. There are others who feel that the ones like Azad and Ansar, not Ansari because he died in the mid-30s, but certainly Azad and other nationalist Muslims, they were traitors. That they took it was a wrong judgment call, or that they were traitors. And Azad for a long time was seen as a traitor by many in the Muslim League.
That's also more of the official narrative.
That is also the official narrative, but there is also a great deal of admiration and respect for him. It doesn't directly answer your question, but I was struck by this, that the father of the Pakistani nuclear bomb, what's his name? But
I'm also forgetting. Huh? No.
A.Q. Khan.
A.Q. Khan.
A.Q. Khan, about 6 or 7 years ago, wrote an article. He had a monthly column where he used to write on religious issues. In one of his columns, he reproduced long extracts of an interview which Maulana Azad had given to a magazine called Chattan. The authenticity of that interview is in some doubt, but he reproduced that interview because Maulana Azad in that, and he had said so in fact on a number of occasions, predicted pretty accurately what is going to happen in Pakistan in the 1970s and thereafter. So he reproduced that whole interview, and said that Maulana Azad was absolutely right in his predictions about Pakistan. So there are all kinds of mixed feelings about, they were when I was there, which is now about 6 years ago. But certainly those views are changing, because as developments in India take place, those views in India also, in Pakistan also are changing about Muslims in India.
Can I just add one point, sir? When we talk about partition and that guilt feeling that we left Muslims behind, actually 95% of the Muslims did not migrate to Pakistan. The actual studies show that the migrations of Indian Muslims to Pakistan was mainly confined to Punjab. So this is, I think that needs to be re-examined, this sense of guilt, because 95% of the Muslims did not migrate.
That is true. But a significant part of the upper middle class from UP and Bihar did.
About 10% of the present day population of Pakistan is constituted by those who came from places in North India other than Punjab. About 10%. So which will be roughly 20 million people.
No, the number in absolute terms may not be large, but they were the thought leaders.
They were the thought leaders.
They were the well-established civil servants, the journalists, many of those prominent in public life. And certainly, you see, you can have different views about partition. I mean, in the end, it depends on your particular perspective. But the movement for Pakistan was till the very end the weakest in the Muslim majority provinces.
Yes.
Because they felt no real need for they were already running the provinces. So they felt no need to. But the issue really was of the Muslim minority provinces.
Probably what you are trying to say, in other words, is that it is people who came from non-Muslim majority areas who played a very leading role in the creation of Pakistan. When they went there, those who were called Muhajir, they were the thought leaders. They had that sense of guilt, maybe. I remember that famous historian and writer, what was his name, from Tonk?
Mubarak Ali.
Mubarak Ali. He has written the autobiography, something like Dar Dar Thokare Khane Ko Majboor. So that in a way sums up what you are trying to say, that they went there with great expectations, thinking that now we have created the land of the pure, and then of course they were disappointed in.
Yeah, the Muhajirs have historically been, from the 1980s onwards, but certainly in the immediate aftermath of partition, they had a very good deal for themselves.
Yes. But that happiness did not last.
Did not last.
I think there is no other question and we have reached the end. Please go ahead. Absolutely the last question.
Yes. Sir, so you talked about the symbolic representation that this marriage of Asaf Ali and Aruna Asaf Ali held. So do you think that Aruna Asaf Ali's actual eking out of a path, a niche very separate to Asaf Ali himself, was actually trying to break away from that symbolic representation, was actually trying to make an identity other than the generation gap? Do you think that could be something that where she was trying to actually show that she had an identity outside of that marriage dynamic?
Dr. Panda also, asked, hinted at the same point, that did she strike out on this particular path because she wanted to get out of the confines into which she found herself? I think it was probably more than that, because as I said, while she had a difficult time settling down, in the end she became part of that community and had, in fact, was well established within it. And it is not as if Asaf Ali envisaged a future, only a domestic future for her. He envisaged for her a future in public life, but not such a radical path as she had taken. He had no objections to her going to jail. She was in jail for some period of time and she was given a grand welcome in Delhi. when she came back, he objected strongly to her going underground, which a number of other Congress leaders did too. They said this underground activity is something which we don't approve of. If you object, get arrested, go to jail. That is the way of registering your protest. So certainly she chose very consciously a more radical path. Now, possibly it was generational, but it's very difficult, as I said, in the absence of a firm historical base. One can guess, but my guess is that it had something to do with the probably the earliest family background of both Aruna Ganguly and Purnima Banerjee. That why should the daughters of the family be so remarkably different from the brothers? It's not as if this is a family which all of them are joining politics, but both the girls strike out on very independent paths. So possibly it has to do with Aruna's own background rather than because of Asaf Ali or the circumstances she found herself in.
May I add just one sentence? Hello?
Yes.
Yes. Actually, Aruna Ganguly was a Bengali, and the leftist movement was quite, I mean, it started in Bengal, it was strong in Bengal. So there might be some tenuous link between her radicalization and, I would say, kind of romantic imagination and estrangement from her husband and choosing a different path. I mean, this is just just an suggestion, nothing else.
Thank you. I think we have reached the end of today's lecture and discussion. We have had a wonderful lecture, great discussion, and we are really thankful to Dr. C A Raghavan for coming here and delivering this lecture. And I'm very, very thankful to all members of the audience also for their enthusiastic participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.